Okay, so now the last thing is really some debt assumptions before we can kind of finish our sources and uses of funds table. Again, we haven't really gone through the process of securing debt yet. We're about to start getting financing indications. But at this point in the mini model, you're just making an assumption based on the typical sort of debt profile that you're usually going to put on a deal like this. And in this case, we're saying, we can get usually up to 5 times EBITDA on a company. The amount is 270 million, which means we think we can fund about half of this because the enterprise value is 540 million. So around half comes from debt. So again, 5 times EBITDA, right? The purchase price is 10 times, so half of that comes in the form of debt. And then a couple of other basic assumptions around typical debt issues in an LBO. So for example, we might take on a revolver that at the beginning is undrawn. Let's assume that the current rates on that are LIBOR plus 450 basis points with a LIBOR floor of 1.5%, which means at a minimum, we're gonna pay 6% on any revolver that we draw on. Again, we're gonna get far more sophisticated about revolver terms and things like that when we get into the full LBO. But at this point, it's just high level assumptions. Now, let's assume that the way that we're going to fund this, the main way we're going to fund this is with a unitranche term loan, basically just one loan package that, so you don't have bonds and loans, you don't have term loan A, term loan B, commingled. You just have one loan, and we'll talk about specifics about when you have unitranche versus other term loan and both term loan, revolver, and bond structures. So we're going to keep this simple. And let's say that 1.5% of that term loan, of that 270, has to be paid down every year. And let's also assume that 75% of any cash that the company generates has to get swept into the term loan, right? As part of the condition of the borrowing, they say, okay, if you generate any excess cash, 75% of that, you're going to have to sweep this. You're going to have to pay down above and beyond the 1.5%, right? So those are the simple assumptions. And then some other financing assumptions. We have a revolving credit facility of $50 million. If we don't use it, we're paying 0.5% on that, right? We have the rate on that as well. And this is unused from the get-go, right? So when we get to our debt schedule, we're going to see that the revolver is unused at the beginning, but it can go up to $50 million. Whatever you're not using, you're going to pay 0.5% on. There's no minimum cash balance. Again, we're keeping this simple that, we're going to, those of you who have gone through our full modeling courses, hey, you've got a minimum cash balance. Companies will never dip below, say, $10 million in cash every year. They're going to keep money in the bank. We're not going to add that complexity here. Circuit breaker, again, for those who have gone through standard modeling courses, know that there's a circularity in interest. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, you can ignore it, but we're going to switch this to 0 to avoid the problem altogether. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Financing fees. So fees that you have to pay, we're going to amortize those over the term of the borrowing, and the interest rate on cash is going to be 1%. So we've got a couple of those financing fee assumptions. The sources and uses of funds are laid out here, just like they are above in the summary output. But down below where the model is, it's just a little bit more detailed where we're talking about sort of the EBITDA turns that the sources relate to, as well as the uses of funds that amounts to, right? So we've got purchase price plus these transaction and financing fees. Now, pro forma ownership, the company that we as the financial sponsor are buying 100% of this. We're not rolling anything over. So that's all there is there. Again, that'll all change if Zach and the other management do roll over some of their equity. And now that's it. So we have all the assumptions in place to really build out the forecast. Now management has given us the forecast, right? So this short form model is about taking management forecasts, here they are, and basically putting them into a model. They've given us revenue from 2017 all the way to 2024, all the way down to net income. We've simply just put that in. Now, one thing for those that are, familiar with financial modeling and have done some of it, you'll notice that, here we got blue cells that are hard-coded and these are formulas. Well, why do we need to put formulas in this model? Why don't we just hard-code the 493.5 here? And the reason is because we want that 8.5% growth that the company's, expected to generate, and the 8% growth and 7%, et cetera. We want that to be the hard code. Right? We want that to be the hardcore code that the formula is driven off of. And that's important for if we decide to flex the assumptions. If we say, well, what if they only achieve 5%? How does that change the model? If you just hard-coded these numbers, then you wouldn't be able to flex that. You'd have to flex the absolute values, which is a little cumbersome and awkward because it doesn't tie to your gross profits and things like that. So this is the way to do it. Basically flex the growth rate, gross margin, sales and marketing that the company's provided. And in fact, I want you to notice something. We're going to exactly match by doing this what the company's forecasts are, right? So this is the management case, gets you down to an EBITDA of 101.4. You could certainly look through the mechanics of this. This is very straightforward sort of financial modeling mechanics. And then we get down to EBIT, again, which is what the company's provided. But then when you get down to here, this is kind of where the model no longer just takes what management is saying. And the reason for that is because, and hopefully some of you can start thinking about this, is look, I've got an EBIT forecast of 72.5 million. That's what I'm assuming. But then look at what happens with my interest expense. It's way higher than what these guys are assuming without a deal. In fact, they're not even explicitly saying it, but they're showing you, hey, we think net income is going to be 53 million, where my net income is 31 million. Can anyone guess why that's happening? Well, hopefully you guess right, and that's because we're about to lever this thing up. So the private equity buyer is going to lever this with that $270 million unitranche term loan. And so that's going to change everything down below here. All right, so going forward, everything down below here is changing. So before I can get into that, just understand we match the management case. In fact, it's everything down to here. So we match the management case down to the sort of operating profit level. And then we're going to have to layer in the capital structure changes down here. So that's a common feature of what you have to do. And then, one thing that this sim did not provide is a working capital forecast. That's not uncommon, but they did provide us with historical balance sheet items, working capital, and any other non-debt or non-cash items. So we see that here, and we're basically going to use some corporate finance best practices to forecast this out. So we put the accounts receivable, here's that 15.1 matched to the 15. By the way, as a side, understand that you can only get the data that management gives you. So at this point, let's grow this out. So those of you who have taken our modeling course know that we simply, without some sort of thesis and more diligence, we're simply going to grow the working capital items with their natural operating partners. In this case, it's revenue growth and inventory. We can either grow this with revenue or grow it with the cost of goods sold growth rate more, maybe a little bit more directly. And so why don't we do that? Let's grow. Well, in fact, this is a simple model. Let's keep it simple. Let's grow everything here at the revenue growth rate. And that way, this isn't more modeling hassle than we want it to be. So we're going to grow everything at the revenue growth rate. And we're going to, in fact, I can just anchor this thing and make my job a little bit easier here. So let's do that. Let's make sure I got the right anchoring. Yep, I did. And I'm going to copy and paste this across. And so I've grown everything with revenue. Again, you can spend a lot more time on this later on. But for now, we just want simple high-level kind of assumptions, and that's exactly what we're doing. We're going to grow everything with revenue, and we should be good to go. So now we've got some basic working capital forecasts. So now we have, the detail around our working capital, and then we have what is CapEx for the purposes of cash flow forecasting as a percentage of revenue. Truth is, I don't think we included this for you guys, but again, this would either come from them, and if it didn't come from the management, we would have to make an assumption. We'd have to make some sort of assumption because CapEx for a business like this will likely be CapEx. I will say it's unusual for management not to provide any sort of material sort of expenditures historically, and so this is something you more likely you would see. And if you don't, you would look at things like D&A historically to figure out what CapEx might be, or this might merit a follow-up conversation or a call.